Hello and welcome back to this series on mapping the shadow. This is part 4, and we're now going to be answering the question, what exactly is shadow work? So in the previous lessons here, I've introduced the shadow mapping model. We've looked a bit at what the likes of Jung and the idealist philosophers, Schelling and Hegel in particular, have said about these ideas. I've made the case that I think these idealist thinkers have perhaps more in common with Jung than meets the eye, at least under the surface. Now, on the surface, that's clearly not true. I mean, Jung was not an idealist, and he was actually very critical of Hegel. But I think that arguably, it would have been good to consider these guys more and understand what was due to them in terms of what they brought to the table, what they offered philosophy, and what that then meant for psychology. Here we are now talking about shadow work, and my thesis is that shadow work is powerful, essential. It's a key task for a lot of folks in modern age. There's a case we made that this is societally what we need to be thinking about. It's coming to terms with the deepest parts of ourselves. But at the same time, that shadow work contains a lot of problems of its own, a lot of contradictions of its own. And a lot of those have their root in the fact that it's become too focused as a psychology and too bent towards mere pragmatism. Following this formula, doing things a certain way, operating on certain assumptions, and that's good and useful to a point. But like everything, it can be both a vehicle and a trap. And the great irony is that actually is when we zoom out and start considering the thoughts of these idealist philosophers, that a lot of these areas of contention start to make a lot more sense. And not only that, but the concept of morality itself. It's almost like you can't talk about the shadow without talking about morality, right? Or the evil parts of ourselves. But what does that even mean? Well, you'll be hard pressed to find a definition of that anywhere in psychology. Psychology doesn't consider it to be its remit to talk about morality. But how can you not talk about morality when you're talking about the shadow? Why is it that we resist certain things? Because we judge them as bad, no? Why do we judge them as bad? What is this morality? Where does it come from? So, there's a lot to be said here. But it is, interestingly, when we zoom out and start dealing with these idealist philosophers, that we can actually solve all these problems. And the other thing I was going to say there was that shadow work as a pursuit is no exception when it comes to moral transgression or it being used as a tool of manipulation or a tool of harm and as an attempt to drag others into a dynamic in the service of one's own self-avoidance. It's no exception. It's no different from any other pursuit. The list of grievances against organized religion is endless. The list of grievances against shadow work and shadow work community is basically non-existent. Spiritual communities of all kinds, we've probably all had experiences, but there's certain areas where it's less commonly thought of that there's likely to be a problem. But you know what? For someone whose intention is to use such tools as a way to extract other people's inner content, get them to project it onto them, and do it all as a way to avoid themselves and to gain power. Are they going to be hanging out in your local church? Well, yeah, probably, maybe. But you know what? If they're really trying hard to hide themselves, they're going to go to the place you least expect. So, when you find yourself in a community or in a meetup or attending a course where it has all the signs of being something completely just, okay, this is where it's at. These people are serious. These are the ones who really want to know themselves. There's nothing untoward here. That's when you do well to be most careful, because they can also be the most attractive hangouts for people who's precisely looking for a new and upgraded camouflage. Every time there's a great cult abuse story in the news or going back several decades, when they occurred at the time, it was never thought of as common knowledge that, oh yeah, this is the dangerous place, whether it's the People's Temple, whether it was the Heaven's Gate or whatever, all these really extreme examples. most cults aren't that extreme. Most situations of abuse, they might be just as sinister, just as dangerous in some ways. They might not be as overt, but one reason for that is precisely because what we consider to be overt has changed, and the camouflage has changed, and the environment has changed, and now it's all happening online largely. So it really does help to understand. So that was a bit of a long intro to this topic of what exactly is shadow work. And the point being made here is really just that we can go back to idealism to really understand what it actually is. So I'm first going to read this quote by Michael Tsarin from his book on German idealism. He said that for Hegel, the process of truth or logic can be subdivided into three general stages. The origin of the process we call mind begins with the first truth, namely that mind is inadequate in its understanding of self and world. The second truth is that mind must endeavor to overcome or negate its cognitive limitations. This is accomplished through time and experience, by grasping nature and the objects of the world, and by absorbing them according to the implicit need for self-discovery. Mind knows an object by taking it into itself. In this way, knowledge or truth involves a metaphysical nucleation or transcendence of subject and object. Next, the mind discovers that self-consciousness largely depends upon the encounter and correct assessment of the existence of other self-conscious beings in cultural settings. Now, Tsarin is not saying this in the context of shadow work, but I wanted to quote this because what about this isn't shadow work? Okay, so when we talk about shadow work, maybe we're thinking about a psychological context, we're thinking about getting coaching, this kind of thing. But really, it's this process of, well, these three stages here. It's realizing that we don't fully understand ourselves. Secondly, trying to overcome that cognitive limitation by bringing objects of the world into ourselves, by encountering the world with empathy. And this third step, which is actually understanding that there are the existence of other self-conscious beings, and that's how we actually relate to ourselves, understand ourselves as self-conscious beings. It wouldn't be enough just to walk around in nature, climb some mountains and walk through some forests. In order to truly know our own self-consciousness, we have to encounter it and assimilate it in others as well. But this is completely analogous, at least, to shadow work. And so when I'm speaking of the shadow map, this is, yes, a coaching tool for shadow work, but it's also a model of conflict. It's a model of existence. It's a map for how things change and evolve. It applies to shadow, but it applies to an infinite number of things. It applies to everything in some way. You can apply this to politics. You can apply this to economics. You can apply this to your decision of whether or not to eat chocolate cake this evening. You can apply this to the tarot cards in your tarot birth chart. You can apply this to culture. You can apply this to organizations, organizational culture, team dynamics. There's no end to what this can be applied to. It stretches far beyond a personality model and aims to be a thinking tool based on those three premises I mentioned in the first video, i.e. duality, energy, and wholeness. These are three premises you can apply to help you think through all these different facets of life and experience. Hence, shadow work is merely one, but one very important instance of this dialectical process. That's the point I'm making. It is this dialectical process as it pertains to the macro arc of our personalities over the course of our lives. Now, that's not the only place we encounter shadow. All of those things I just mentioned have conscious and shadow aspects. Your working day has a kind of arc to it that includes a shadow. When you put petrol in your car and you burn it in the engine, it too contains a kind of shadow. There's an inherent non-contradiction in that, which must create heat in its need to maintain consistency, And it also creates externalities. It also produces emissions, for example, and various other effects that beyond a point become intolerable. They start to create problems over time, or in certain amounts. So what Michael Sarin is referring to in his quote is this more holistic metaphysical function of mind that is playing out with all of us every moment of every day and in existence and the universe at large. It's the same thing that's operating in the context of our own lives, the arc of our personality, and that is what we call shadow work. It is the process of coming to terms with those parts of our personality we've left behind. That itself includes many layers and stages. And there may well be a certain core nucleus or several of those. Often people talk about complexes and shadow pretty much interchangeably. And I think there's a good case for that. They are, when viewed through this light, kind of the same thing. The shadow is a kind of complex. Complexes, you can kind of think of them as a kind of shadow. I mean, Jung might not have phrased it that way, but when you look at it in this way, you can see how actually they are very much about duality and energy and wholeness, and the compensation that occurs as a result of the enantiodromia, this running to the opposite that occurs. So we're taking this very zoomed out holistic view right now. So here's how I think about shadow work. Here's my definition. So shadow work is the active unification of our conscious selves with the aspects that we find disagreeable or that we repress. There's 4 parts to this process. There's first the identification, there's the confronting, there's accepting, and integrating these hidden aspects. And this is really about energy. It's about the resolution of energetic conflicts and resistances rooted in stored emotions and feelings that have been obstructing their recognition. So it's very much about confronting feeling. There's no progress without that. Not just feeling, but also the whole shadow experience. It's bringing that into conscious awareness, where these disparate energetic forces can meet and reconcile. And this is why it's sometimes referred to as alchemy, because what is alchemy, right? You know, you're taking, or literally taking 2 chemicals and blending them together, and it produces, if you take, you know, chlorine and sodium, you get table salt, right? You wouldn't want to eat either of them on their own, or you wouldn't want to breathe in too much chlorine, but you mix them together and, you know, you put it on your eggs. So it's this new thing that didn't really exist before, and yet in some way it contains both of what came before, and it gives something off. It gives off energy. So there's an analogy there for how it sort of discards something that's no longer true or no longer needed. So then if we work through an example here, let's take, say, someone with the personality type INFJ. Now, the INFJ is actually one of the rarest personality types. It's Myers-Briggs, if you're not already familiar with that. It just means someone who is an introverted intuitive who also uses feeling as a way to make decisions, particularly extroverted, harmonizing feeling. So INFJs tend to be very in touch with the hidden world. They tend to have a great sense of like what's coming down the line, looking forward to the future. But also they tend to be very sensitive to what's going on with other people. They sometimes say they can walk into a room and instantly, you know, sense the vibe of the room, what's going on, and what's going on for the individuals in it. This is to say nothing about whether that proclivity is used for wholesome or unwholesome ends. It doesn't mean that they necessarily make good coaches or therapists. If they use those skills well, almost invariably they can. If they don't, then they can be a real hazard. So take the INFJ, for example. So if you take the quality here described as INFJ, and you take that to its extreme, what do you get? You get INFJ. It's still INFJ. It's the same flavor, the same quality. But here, just taken to an absolute extreme. So this is still someone who has this preference for intuition, backed up with feeling. But in order to truly know themselves, the INFJ does well to encounter their opposite in the world. which in personality type terms is the ESTP. So just a brief technical point here. Not only does the ESTP have the opposite 4-letter combination, extroverted sensing, thinking, perceiving, but they also have the precise cognitive functions in the reverse order. So what the ESTP leads with, extroverted sensing, is an INFJ's inferior function. Now, if you remember the quote by Jung from the last episode here, he said that the inferior function is pretty much analogous to, let's just dig out that quote to make sure we get that right. He said that the inferior function is practically identical with the dark side of the human personality, which means that for the INFJ, the ESTP's primary way of showing up is the INFJ's dark side of their personality. So they might well encounter their shadow in the form of an ESTP, maybe one who's behaving in a particularly unwholesome way, in whatever way that shows up. Maybe they're just so active, energetic, and the INFJ just doesn't like it. Fine. But maybe they're also using those very same gifts for nefarious ends. So whatever the reason, it's highly likely that they will experience some form of ESTP type shadow. Someone showing up with a lot of extroverted sensing behaviors, and also maybe even introverted thinking, which the INFJ uses as well. But in order to truly understand themselves, go back to Sarian's quote here, well, they first understand that their initial understanding is inadequate. They neither fully understand themselves nor the person they're encountering. The second is that state cannot exist perpetually because it's one-sided, because nothing in isolation can exist perpetually by virtue of the very same forces that gave rise to it, by virtue of its own self-negation, and by virtue of the very thing that it leaves out. Now, in just the same way, true intuition, let's say, includes an aspect of sensing. True feeling includes an aspect of thinking. So without engaging the opposite, it isn't really even true intuition. It isn't really even true feeling. So there's this clear cognitive limitation. This is the second truth that he lays out. And this is felt as a tension, maybe even as a kind of suffering or pain. And it becomes an implicit need to overcome. It must be done. So this brings us on to the third truth, which actually, just rewind, as part of that second truth, there's a need for the INFJ to encounter the ESTP and take them into themselves. So yes, there's going to be the shadow position, which they're by definition going to find intolerable at the beginning, and maybe for good reason. Maybe this person is doing silly, evil, nefarious things. Strange things have happened. But in the end, they're going to want to encounter the ESTP in their wholesome form. At the very least, even encountering it in their unwholesome form, in the shadow position, they can still engage with the antithesis through that encounter. So they can understand exactly what it is in the ESTP that they need in order to realize themselves. And then lastly, here's third truth. They come to understand that this other person is another self-conscious being. And in doing so, there's this kind of meta lesson that they understand their own self-consciousness and the self-reflective nature of their own mind. And this is my own additions here, but that there is this meta lesson around understanding the nature and the workings of mind itself, not just these isolated mini lessons that they're all necessary and they're important, but these are all kind of instances of a more overarching lesson, which is that this is a journey, and there is this self-reflective quality, and we do well to engage in this process consciously. That's what our conscious role is. So, last slide of this lesson now. So, there's a lot of concepts from philosophy and from psychology that are highly relevant to shadow work. and yet are not discussed nearly often enough. I've listed them here. I've listed 10, and I'll just read them off one by one briefly. So, self-love, empathy, synthesis, energy, armoring, defense, self-hate, narcissism, evil, and discernment. Right, what's he talking about? There's these very important concepts to understand that are almost never discussed when we talk about shadow work. And I think it's a real shame. It's very important we understand how these concepts relate to shadow work, because they're all highly relevant. One perspective, shadow work is the ultimate exercise in self-love, right? It's coming to terms with the repressed aspects of ourselves. And again, to quote Margaret Siren, shadow work is to cease to do harm to the self. That's what shadow work is about. Of course, it's hard to do that unless we know how it is we're actually harming ourselves. So a lot of the work is in that identification piece I mentioned earlier. It's exploring, it's understanding where are we actually harming ourselves without realizing it. How is it that we're serving power and maybe consciously thinking we're doing a good thing because it's what we've known, it's worked in a sense in the past. Unconsciously, we're sacrificing great swathes of ourselves and doing immense harm and maybe not even realizing it. Maybe thinking or perceiving it as something that's arising externally, and maybe it is. This is the interesting thing. This is where things get a bit potentially unintuitive, is that actually, the boundaries between what we merely perceive and what we actually experience in the world, what's the difference, right? So self-love is key, self-hate being the other side of that, of course. And then empathy, because what is empathy? Well, I talk about this at length in various places, but I think of empathy as the willingness to meet and transform with experience of yourself, the experience of the world. Yes, we might think of it as like something like compassion, and compassion is included in empathy, like true compassion is included in empathy. We think of it as feeling another's pain. But when we feel the other's pain, we're feeling it through the lens of our own mind, of course. So we're also feeling our own pain in empathy. Empathy, I think of as this willingness to meet with that tension, to hold it, to experience it, to work through it. It's occurred to me just now that actually the opposite of empathy is not only evil, sure, or an unwillingness to engage. But there's also like a kind of psychic laziness as well. Empathy is like the opposite of psychic laziness. Empathy is the willingness to feel, if nothing else, is the willingness to feel. It's the willingness to be conscious of something, of what you need to be conscious of in order to gain self-knowledge, in order to fulfill your role in all this, in order to bring things to their implicit potential. So let's move on from that. Synthesis, I've already mentioned this in this series. So synthesis is the bringing together of two apparent opposites and combining them, facilitating them into a higher order understanding and truth. So it's not about balance, it's not about compromise, it's about, well, it's also referred to as sublation, which means to include and transcend. So if we bring us back to our example of INFJ, when the INFJ encounters the ESTP, they can resist, they can try and resist perpetually. They might even need to resist for a temporary period until the time is right to actually do the work. But there's always empathy there, hopefully. Empathy is never unethical, and a lack of empathy is never ethical, by the way. But in undergoing this engagement, there is a synthesis. And what emerges is the self. It's not INFJ, it's not ESTP, because you know what? You are not an INFJ. I am not an INFJ. No one is an INFJ. INFJ is a word, and it's 4 letters. You're not a word, right? So what you is what you is. INFJ is a vehicle, it's a way of understanding. It corresponds to an observed reality. But the synthesis leads to a greater realization of what you is. And what you is not INFJ. Energy, we've discussed already as well, but energy is very important to understand, not least because of its compensatory and enantiodromic qualities. So in other words, it produces opposites. If we double down on anything to its limit, it produces a compensatory effect. And also this enantiodromia, where actually these things become their opposites by virtue of needing to reconcile, but also by virtue of being very, very distant from the source, from what there is. Armoring, you rarely hear this except within bioenergetic circles. You might even hear it in any kind of bodywork circles. And armoring is the body trying to defend itself. So whatever tension we're trying to placate, there's various ways in which the body can armor itself. Commonly, this is seen through fat deposits. So not all the time, but one reason, if we find ourselves putting on loads of weight, you might say, well, it's because we're eating a lot, right? We're eating bad quality food, we're eating junk food, we're eating food that damages our gut lining and leads to all kinds of inflammation. And this all contributes to obesity, not to mention the actual foods we're eating are very moreish, nutritionally poor. Obviously, that's going to play with our appetite and lead us to consume more calories than we actually need. But why are we doing that? What's the reason for eating that much? And it's very, very subtle and insidious the way the mind can trick you into doing that. And you might be experiencing some kind of chronic stress, some unresolved trauma, and maybe have got to a point where the daily eating and the pattern of eating is so normalized that you don't even realize that it's an armoring process, that actually this is a way of dealing with something that has not yet at least been confronted. So sometimes the best weight loss advice, presuming it's weight loss you need and not, weight gain, but, obviously being overweight is a bigger problem in our world right now. The best weight loss advice might be confront your trauma, right? Anyone can give you any number of strategies for losing weight or for getting fit. There's no mystery there. There's better and worse ways of doing it, no doubt. And those different strategies make a big difference. But the number one thing is the very willingness and the ability to do it. And if your unconscious mind is just taking the reins and you're self-sabotaging, then that is the thing to look at. It's not about trying to control your mind, because that's the very point, right? It's the very desire to control. Remember, in enantiodromia, take control to an extreme, what happens? You become completely out of control. So neither is it about completely throwing caution to the wind. It's about bringing empathy to the tension and confronting it, and being willing to confront it. And we're now in territory of, well, how to do that? Well, it's free will. It's in large part free will. It's also based in understanding. It's habit 1, take responsibility for your mind. Habit 2, cultivate wholesome intentions. And it's based on understanding and free choice. And no one's saying that there's, it's better to be this way than another way. That would be completely antithetical to this whole pursuit. You be however you want to be. There's nothing wrong with that. However, what you cannot be, and not because I said you can't, not because anyone said you can't, but because you yourself physically cannot contradict yourself. Not permanently. You can try it for a while. In other words, if you want to be a certain way, fine. If you don't want to be a certain way and you find yourself being that way, that's another thing. If you say one thing and do another, or you think one thing and do another, or there's any kind of incongruency there, there's a contradiction, and that is where to look. I could go on, but I think it's also important to mention the last 3 here because they're related: narcissism, evil, and discernment. And one of the greatest challenges in not just spiritual circles and even shadow work circles, but just our world in general, the overall zeitgeist, any workplace you go in, we do not have a very well fleshed out understanding of evil. And on one level, you can understand that because it doesn't matter how much philosophy is done, how much people write about it, how intricately people like Schelling think about it. We have to come to our own understanding. And reading other people's thoughts on evil can only take us so far. But that all said, it is necessary as part of shadow work to understand what evil is. Because anytime you read Jung, anytime you read Murray Stein, anytime you read any Jungian talking about the shadow, they're going to mention evil at some point. It's a related topic. As for what evil is, we're going to be getting onto that, and we're going to be looking at the works of Schelling on that as well. But having discernment, understanding that there's a difference because duality itself is dual. Because there's a difference between seeing something and merely not liking it versus seeing something and understanding the intention behind it and what that's really being driven by. So it's not really enough just to say that everyone's different or that there's everyone has their own preferences, and it's certainly not enough to say that it's just your own projection or the result of a bad childhood alone or something. There's always free will involved, and we have to understand this. Understanding free will and responsibility is fundamental to shadow work. And likewise, if someone is seeking out so-called shadow work, but they're not interested in understanding this, they're not really doing shadow work. They're interested in another persona. They're interested in another way of making themselves look like they're already where they could be in potentiality. But in the absence of any willingness to actually face attention, to embody empathy, to do the work, they go for the subtlest sometimes, maybe even the coarsest, the most obvious simulacra, the way of showing that they're doing work without really doing it. So yeah, these are all really important dynamics to understand. But for now, we're just talking about what shadow work is. I hope I've made it clear in this episode here. So thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you in the next one, which is why integrate the shadow and why now.